Hey family, welcome to Mr. Gray Family, where every story begins with us. Memphis, Tennessee was glowing under the warm lights of a luxury hotel that overlooked Mississippi River. Inside the grand ballroom, everything looked perfect. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above rows of elegantly dressed guests. White roses lined a long aisle that stretched toward a beautifully decorated altar. A string quartet played a gentle melody that floated through the room, while servers quietly moved between tables offering champagne. This wasn't just any wedding. It was the wedding of one of the most powerful businessmen in Memphis, Gary. At 38 years old, Gary was a billionaire CEO known for building one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the country. Investors respected him. Media outlets followed him. And tonight, hundreds of wealthy guests had gathered to watch him begin what many believed would be the next perfect chapter of his life. Standing at the altar in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, Gary looked exactly like the world expected him to look. Calm, successful, completely in control. From the outside, it was the picture of confidence. But inside, Gary felt something he couldn't quite explain. A strange weight in his chest. Across the ballroom, guests whispered excitedly while waiting for the ceremony to begin. Business leaders, politicians, and social elites filled the room, all eager to witness the moment. The music softened. A wedding planner quietly signaled that everything was ready. The ceremony was seconds away. Gary adjusted his cufflinks and glanced toward the aisle where his future was about to walk in. Then suddenly, his phone vibrated. Once, twice. The unexpected sound felt oddly loud in the quiet room. Gary frowned slightly. Normally, he would ignore a call during such an important moment, but something about the persistence made him reach into his pocket. He stepped slightly aside from the altar and answered. Hello? On the other end of the line, a calm voice spoke. Hello? Is this Gary? Yes, he replied. The voice continued. I'm calling from a hospital here in Memphis. Gary's expression tightened. A hospital? There was a brief pause. Then the voice said a name Gary hadn't heard in a long time. Teresa. The world seemed to slow. Memories flashed through Gary's mind. Music. Laughter. Warm Memphis nights. Gary cleared his throat. Is she okay? The voice answered carefully. She's in labor. Gary blinked. In labor? Yes. Another pause followed. Then the sentence that stopped everything. She says the twins she's delivering are yours. For a moment, Gary didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't speak. Behind him, the music stopped. Guests began whispering. A quiet ripple of confusion moved across the ballroom. Gary stood frozen, the phone still pressed against his ear. His wedding ceremony was about to begin. But somewhere across Memphis, his past had just returned. And it wasn't alone. It was bringing two new lives into the world. Now let's pause for a moment. Because this is where the story stops being just about Gary. It becomes about you. Think about it carefully. You're standing at the altar. Hundreds of people are watching. Your future is only seconds away from walking down the aisle. The music is ready. The guests are smiling. Everything has been planned perfectly for months. And suddenly, your phone rings. On the other end of that call is someone from your past. Someone you once loved. Someone you believed was no longer part of your life. And they tell you something that changes everything in a single sentence. They're about to give birth to your children. 2 of them. Now ask yourself honestly, what would you do in that moment? Would you ignore the call? Would you silence the phone, straighten your suit, and continue the ceremony as if nothing happened? After all, your reputation is on the line. Your family is watching. Your business partners are sitting in the audience. The media might even be outside waiting to capture the celebration. Walking away could destroy the image you've spent years building. But staying could mean pretending that 2 innocent lives entering the world don't exist. So what matters more? Your reputation or your responsibility? Would you protect the life you carefully built? Or would you walk away from the altar to face the truth waiting somewhere across the city? This is the exact decision Gary had to make that day in Memphis, and the choice he made left an entire ballroom in shock. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. If you were in Gary's position, standing at that altar with that phone call in your hand, what would you do? Tell me in the comments below. Gary slowly lowered the phone from his ear. The voice on the other end had already finished speaking, but the words continued echoing inside his mind. Teresa, in labor. twins. For several seconds he simply stood there. The ballroom remained quiet, yet something had changed. Guests were starting to notice the tension on his face. A few people leaned toward each other, whispering softly. The wedding planner near the aisle glanced nervously toward Gary, unsure whether the ceremony should begin. Gary looked across the room. Hundreds of eyes, investors, business partners, friends, family members. Everyone had gathered to witness a moment that was supposed to symbolize certainty, a perfect future. But Gary knew something none of them knew. Across Memphis, Teresa was in a hospital room fighting through labor, and the children she was about to bring into the world were his. Gary took a slow breath, then another. He glanced down at the phone still in his hand. For a brief moment it looked like he might step back toward the altar and continue the ceremony. The room waited. The music players looked toward the wedding planner. The guests leaned forward in their seats, but instead of returning to the altar, Gary turned and began walking toward the exit. At first, the movement confused people. Some guests assumed he needed a quick moment before the ceremony began. But when Gary passed the first row of chairs without stopping, the whispers grew louder. The groom continued walking, straight past the aisle, straight past the wedding planner who stood frozen with confusion, straight toward the grand ballroom doors. Behind him, the bride remained standing near the entrance, still waiting, still unaware of why the groom had suddenly disappeared. And just like that, the wedding stopped. No announcement, no explanation, just silence spreading across a room full of stunned guests. Before we go any further, let's take a moment right here, because the decision Gary made in that ballroom is something most people will never face in their entire lives. Walking away from a wedding, especially a wedding like that, doesn't just affect two people. It shakes families. It confuses friends. It spreads questions through an entire city. And yet Gary walked out without saying a word. So now the real question becomes yours. If you were standing in his position, what would you have done? Would you stay at the altar and protect the life everyone expected you to live? Or would you step out of that room and face a responsibility that appeared without warning? Take a second and tell me honestly in the comments. I read them, and I love seeing how different people view moments like this. And if stories about real decisions, real consequences, and powerful life lessons are the kind of stories you enjoy, make sure you support the channel. Hit the like button so more people can discover stories like this. Share this video with someone who enjoys meaningful storytelling. And most importantly, subscribe to Mr. Gray Family, because every story here is created to make you feel something, learn something, and remember something. Welcome to Mr. Gray Family, a storytelling universe built for people who crave meaning, emotion, and unforgettable narratives. Here, every story begins with a spark and ends with a feeling you'll carry long after the video ends. Love, betrayal, family, secrets, lessons, it's all here, wrapped in immersive narration that makes you forget everything else. If you're searching for stories that pull your heart, challenge your mind, and keep you coming back, subscribe now. Your story begins the moment you choose to stay. Because to understand why Gary made the decision that stopped an entire wedding in Memphis, we need to go back to where everything truly began. Back to a night filled with music. Back to the moment Gary first met Teresa. Back to the streets of Memphis, Tennessee, where two completely different worlds unexpectedly collided. The grand ballroom of the historic Memphis Hotel glowed beneath towering crystal chandeliers that reflected light across polished marble floors. Tall windows stretched along the far wall, offering a sweeping view of the Mississippi River moving quietly through the city. Everything inside the ballroom had been arranged with absolute precision. Rows of white roses decorated the aisle leading to the altar. Soft golden candles flickered along each row of chairs. A string quartet played a gentle melody that floated through the air, creating the kind of atmosphere usually reserved for society weddings that people talked about for years. And this was exactly that kind of wedding. Guests had traveled from across the country to attend. Executives from major corporations stood in small circles discussing markets and investments while holding champagne glasses. Local politicians shook hands with business leaders. Cameras flashed quietly as a few invited media figures captured photographs of the elegant setting. Everyone in the room understood the significance of this event. Gary, one of Memphis's most powerful business figures, was about to be married. At 38 years old, Gary had built a reputation as a brilliant strategist in the logistics industry. His company had expanded rapidly over the past decade, turning him into one of the wealthiest entrepreneurs in the region. People respected his discipline. They admired his ambition. And tonight, many believed they were watching the beginning of the next major chapter of his life. Standing near the altar in a perfectly fitted black tuxedo, Gary appeared calm on the outside. His posture was straight, his expression controlled. From a distance, he looked exactly like a man ready to step confidently into marriage. But up close, the story was different. Gary's eyes occasionally drifted toward the tall windows overlooking the river, as if his thoughts were somewhere far beyond the celebration unfolding around him. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve slowly. One of the wedding planners approached him with a reassuring smile. "Everything is ready," she said softly. "The ceremony will begin in just a moment." Gary nodded politely. "Thank you." Across the ballroom, guests were beginning to settle into their seats. Conversations softened as anticipation grew. The musicians adjusted their instruments, preparing to begin the ceremonial music. A quiet excitement spread through the room. Gary glanced toward the entrance of the ballroom where the bride would soon appear. For months, this day had been carefully planned. Every detail, every guest, every arrangement. It was supposed to unfold perfectly. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. At first, Gary ignored it. He assumed it was another congratulatory message or a call from someone unable to attend the ceremony. The phone vibrated again and again. The repeated interruption felt unusual. Gary reached into his pocket and glanced at the screen. An unfamiliar number. He hesitated. A wedding planner nearby noticed the slight change in his expression. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Gary forced a small smile. "Yes. Just a quick call." He stepped a few feet away from the altar and answered. "Hello?" A calm voice responded from the other end. "Hello. Is this Gary?" "Yes, speaking. I'm calling from a hospital here in Memphis." Gary frowned slightly. "A hospital?" There was a brief pause before the voice continued. "There's someone here who asked us to contact you." Gary felt a strange tension forming in his chest. "Who?" The answer came quietly. "Teresa." The name hit him like a sudden memory he hadn't expected to hear again. Gary stood still. For a moment, the noise of the ballroom faded behind the rush of thoughts inside his mind. He hadn't spoken to Teresa in a long time. He cleared his throat slowly. "Is she okay?" The voice on the phone answered calmly. "She's currently in labor." Gary blinked. "In labor?" "Yes." Another short pause followed. Then the sentence that changed everything. "She says the twins she's delivering are yours." Gary's breath caught. The words seemed impossible. Twins. His mind struggled to process what he had just heard. Across the ballroom, the music stopped as guests prepared for the ceremony to begin. Several people noticed Gary standing unusually still with the phone pressed to his ear. Whispers began moving through the crowd. Gary slowly lowered the phone. His thoughts raced through memories he had buried months earlier. Teresa, their relationship, the quiet goodbye they once shared. And now, 2 children were about to enter the world. His children. A wedding planner approached him again, concern appearing on her face. "Gary?" "The ceremony is about to begin." Gary didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked across the room. Hundreds of guests waited. Business partners, friends, family members. Everyone expected him to walk back to the altar. But Gary understood something they didn't. Across Memphis, Teresa was in a hospital room giving birth. He took a slow breath, then another. Without explaining anything, Gary slipped the phone back into his pocket. He adjusted his jacket, and instead of stepping toward the altar, he turned toward the exit. At first, no one reacted. Guests assumed he simply needed a moment before the ceremony began. But when Gary walked past the first row of chairs without stopping, the confusion grew. Whispers spread across the ballroom. The groom continued walking. Past the guests, past the wedding planner, straight toward the tall ballroom doors. Behind him, the ceremony that had been planned for months quietly collapsed into stunned silence. And without looking back, Gary walked out of his own wedding, long before the wedding that stopped an entire ballroom in Memphis, before the phone call, before the twins, before Gary ever stood at that altar. Life in Memphis had already been moving at its own steady rhythm. Memphis was the kind of city that carried its identity proudly. Music echoed from small clubs along Beale Street almost every night. The smell of slow-smoked barbecue drifted through neighborhoods where people gathered outside after long work days. Churches filled on Sundays, not just with faith, but with conversations, laughter, and shared meals that lasted well into the afternoon. It was a place where people remembered each other's names, where neighbors watched out for one another, where front porches often became the center of evening conversations. And in one lively neighborhood not far from downtown Memphis lived a woman named Teresa. At 31 years old, Teresa had built a reputation among the people around her, not for wealth, not for fame, but for the way she showed up for others. Teresa worked as an event coordinator for a cultural arts organization dedicated to celebrating Memphis heritage. Her job involved planning community gatherings, music festivals, and neighborhood celebrations that brought people together from all walks of life. The work required long hours and constant attention to detail, but Teresa loved it. For her, the reward wasn't just a paycheck. It was the moment when a crowd began to smile. It was the sound of music filling a street that had been quiet earlier in the day. It was watching strangers share food, laughter, and stories under colorful lights she helped arrange. Teresa believed that events weren't just gatherings. They were reminders that people belonged to something larger than themselves. Her co-workers often joked that Teresa could organize a celebration almost anywhere. A small park, a city street, even a simple neighborhood block. Give her a few decorations, some music, and a group of people willing to participate, and somehow she turned ordinary spaces into places where memories were created. But beyond her work, Teresa's life remained deeply connected to her neighborhood. Many evenings after finishing her long workdays, she returned home to streets filled with familiar faces. Neighbors sitting on porches would greet her as she walked by. Kids raced bicycles down the sidewalks while parents called out reminders about homework and dinner. Someone was always grilling food nearby. Someone else was usually telling a story that made the whole block laugh. Teresa loved those moments. They reminded her that success didn't always come from money. Sometimes success meant having people around you who cared. Her upbringing had shaped those values. Teresa grew up in Memphis surrounded by a strong community that believed in helping one another through both joyful moments and difficult times. Church services, neighborhood gatherings, and family dinners were regular parts of her life growing up. From a young age, she learned something important. Character mattered, kindness mattered, and loyalty to the people around you mattered. Those lessons stayed with her well into adulthood. People trusted Teresa because she carried herself with quiet confidence and honesty. When she promised to organize something, it happened. When someone needed help, she showed up. She wasn't someone who tried to impress others. She simply lived in a way that made people feel comfortable around her. Friends often described Teresa using the same words: strong, warm, and sharp enough to solve problems quickly when situations became complicated. But Teresa's life, full of community spirit and cultural celebrations, existed in a completely different world from the life Gary had built for himself. While Teresa spent her days bringing neighborhoods together, Gary's world operated inside glass office towers overlooking the Mississippi River. Boardrooms replaced front porches. Investment meetings replaced block parties. Formal dinners replaced backyard cookouts. Their lives moved through the same city, yet their worlds rarely overlapped. Memphis was large enough for that. Two different lifestyles moving side by side without ever crossing paths. At least, that was true for a while. Because one evening during a large cultural music festival near the Memphis riverfront, the paths of those two very different lives finally collided. Teresa had spent weeks preparing that festival. Food vendors lined the streets. Local musicians were preparing to perform. Bright lights decorated the area as families began gathering to enjoy the warm evening. For Teresa, it was just another event she wanted to make successful. But for Gary, that festival would become the night his life quietly began to change. Because somewhere within the growing crowd, a man in an expensive suit was about to step into a world completely unfamiliar to him. And the woman organizing everything around him had no idea their lives were about to connect in a way neither of them expected. The Memphis riverfront carried a special kind of energy during summer festivals. As the sun lowered over the Mississippi River, the evening air filled with music, laughter, and the rich smell of food cooking from dozens of nearby vendors. Strings of warm lights stretched between poles along the streets, glowing softly as families and visitors gathered to enjoy the celebration. That night, the riverfront had transformed into a lively cultural music festival. Small stages were set up across the area where local musicians prepared their instruments. Some people danced near the speakers while others sat on folding chairs clapping along to the rhythm. Children ran between booths selling handmade crafts and colorful artwork. At the center of all the activity was Teresa. She moved quickly through the crowd with a clipboard in one hand and a walkie-talkie clipped to her side. Her eyes scanned the area constantly, checking details and solving small problems before anyone else even noticed them. "Stage 2 is ready," a voice crackled through her radio. "Perfect," Teresa replied calmly. "Tell the band they can start in 5 minutes." A vendor waved her over from across the walkway. "Teresa, the power cable for our lights just stopped working." Teresa crossed the street quickly, crouching beside the booth to check the connection. "Give me a second," she said. Within a minute, the lights flickered back on. The vendor smiled with relief. "I swear you can fix anything." Teresa laughed lightly. "Not everything, but tonight we'll do our best." Events like this were exactly why she loved her job. Watching people enjoy themselves, hearing the music echo through the streets, and seeing strangers connect over shared experiences made every long hour of preparation worth it. While Teresa moved through the festival, making sure everything ran smoothly, someone new stepped quietly into the crowd. Gary. Earlier that afternoon, one of Gary's business partners had mentioned the festival while discussing investments connected to Memphis tourism. Curious, Gary decided to stop by briefly on his way home. He hadn't expected much. Maybe a quick walk through the area, 10 minutes at most. But the moment he stepped onto the riverfront, he realized this event was different from the formal gatherings he was used to attending. People weren't worried about appearances here. They laughed freely. Music filled the air from every direction, and the entire street felt alive. Gary stood near the edge of the crowd for a moment, observing the scene. Then his attention settled on one person moving confidently through the middle of it all. Teresa. Even from a distance, Gary could see she was clearly in charge of the event. She spoke with performers, guided vendors, and greeted guests with an easy smile. There was something about the way she carried herself. Confident, focused, completely comfortable in the environment around her. Gary watched her for several minutes without realizing how much time had passed. Finally, curiosity pushed him forward. He walked toward one of the smaller stages where Teresa was adjusting a microphone stand for the next band preparing to perform. Without looking up, Teresa spoke casually. "If you're planning to perform tonight, you might want to hurry. The band is about to start." Gary blinked, slightly amused. "I'm not performing." Teresa straightened and finally looked up at him. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Gary noticed her calm confidence and the warm expression in her eyes. Teresa noticed something else. This man clearly came from money, the expensive suit, the polished shoes, but he didn't carry the attitude she usually expected from someone dressed like that. Instead, he looked curious, almost out of place. Teresa crossed her arms playfully. "So what brings a man dressed for a board meeting to a Memphis street festival?" Gary laughed quietly. "Honestly, I'm still trying to figure that out." Teresa smiled. "Well, since you're already here, you might as well enjoy the music. Memphis has a way of convincing people to stay longer than they planned." Gary glanced around at the lively crowd. "I'm starting to see that." For the next few minutes, their conversation continued naturally. Teresa pointed out different parts of the festival, while Gary followed beside her, listening as she explained how local musicians and community groups work together to make the event possible. Gary tried food from a vendor she recommended. He listened to a band she insisted he shouldn't miss. And somewhere during those simple moments, something unexpected began forming between them. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet connection, the kind that grows when two people realize they enjoy each other's company. Eventually, the night grew later, and the crowd began thinning. Gary glanced at his watch before looking back at Teresa. "I should probably head out," he said. Teresa nodded. "Thanks for stopping by. Most people in suits don't last very long at festivals like this." Gary smiled. "Well, maybe I'm not like most people." There was a short pause. Then Gary spoke again. "I know this might sound sudden," he said carefully, "but would you like to have dinner with me sometime?" Teresa raised an eyebrow. "Dinner?" Gary nodded. "Somewhere without loudspeakers and microphone stands." Teresa considered the idea for a moment before smiling slightly. "That depends. On what?" "On whether you promise not to turn it into a business meeting." Gary laughed. "I can promise that." Teresa extended her hand. "All right then, Gary. Dinner sounds like a good idea." Gary shook her hand, and neither of them realized it yet. But that simple handshake on a Memphis street would begin a story that would eventually lead all the way to a hospital delivery room. On the same day Gary was supposed to get married, a few nights after the festival by the Memphis riverfront, Gary found himself sitting at a small restaurant downtown, waiting for someone who had already changed the way he looked at the city, Teresa. The restaurant was quiet compared to the lively streets where they first met. Soft jazz music played in the background, while a few evening diners spoke in low voices at nearby tables. Gary checked his watch briefly. He wasn't nervous about many things in life. Business negotiations, high-stakes investments, and major corporate decisions had become routine for him. But tonight felt different. This wasn't a meeting about contracts or strategy. It was simply dinner. The door opened, and Teresa stepped inside. She wore a simple dress and walked in with the same calm confidence Gary had noticed at the festival. When she spotted him, she smiled. "So this is where the mysterious man in the expensive suit eats dinner," she said playfully as she sat down across from him. Gary laughed. "I promise there are no business presentations tonight." Teresa leaned back slightly. "Good. Because if you brought a briefcase, I was leaving immediately." The conversation began easily. What Gary expected to be a polite dinner slowly turned into something far more natural. They talked about music, about Memphis neighborhoods, about the different ways people in the city experienced life. Gary spoke about building his logistics company and the challenges of managing rapid growth. Teresa spoke about the joy she felt watching communities come together during the events she organized. The contrast between their lives was obvious. Gary spent most of his time inside corporate offices and boardrooms. Teresa spent her days among musicians, artists, and families gathering for cultural celebrations. Yet instead of creating distance, those differences sparked curiosity. Gary wanted to know more about the Memphis Teresa knew so well, and Teresa found Gary's discipline and ambition surprisingly admirable. That dinner turned into another meeting the following week, then another. Before long, dating had become a regular part of their lives. But what made their relationship interesting was how they began introducing each other to completely different versions of Memphis. One weekend, Teresa invited Gary to a neighborhood cookout not far from where she lived. Children played basketball in the street while music played from a nearby speaker. People laughed, shared food, and greeted Gary with friendly curiosity. At first, Gary felt slightly out of place. His world usually involved private dining rooms and formal business conversations. But Teresa moved comfortably through the gathering, introducing him to neighbors and encouraging him to try homemade dishes from the grill. "Relax," she told him quietly. "No one here cares how much money you make." Gary smiled. That might be the first time I've heard that sentence in years. Another evening, Gary introduced Teresa to a completely different setting. A rooftop restaurant overlooking downtown Memphis. Soft lights reflected across the Mississippi River while the city skyline stretched into the distance. Teresa looked around the elegant space with mild curiosity. "This is very different from a neighborhood cookout," she said. Gary nodded. "Two very different worlds." Teresa smiled. "Maybe that's why it's interesting." Over time, they continued showing each other pieces of their lives. Gary attended music clubs where Teresa knew many of the performers. Teresa attended charity events where Gary was recognized by nearly everyone in the room. Sometimes the contrast made them laugh. Other times it made them think. But one thing slowly became clear. Their connection wasn't fading. It was growing. They enjoyed long conversations that stretched late into the night. Sometimes they talked about childhood memories. Sometimes about dreams for the future. Other nights they simply sat together, comfortable in the quiet presence of someone who understood them. For Gary, Teresa brought something into his life that had been missing. Simplicity, genuine warmth, moments where success and reputation didn't matter. And for Teresa, Gary showed her a side of the world she had rarely experienced. Opportunity, ambition, a different kind of confidence shaped by years of determination. Their relationship didn't feel forced. It felt natural. Two people learning from each other, two lives slowly becoming connected. But while Gary and Teresa were enjoying their growing relationship, another reality existed quietly in the background. Gary's business was expanding faster than ever. Investors were watching every move he made. And before long, those same people would begin asking questions about the woman Gary had started spending so much time with. Questions that would slowly place pressure on a relationship that once felt effortless. As the months passed, Gary and Teresa's relationship continued growing in ways neither of them had expected when they first met at the Memphis Riverfront Festival. Their lives became increasingly connected. They spent evenings exploring different parts of the city together, sometimes attending music performances Teresa recommended, other times sharing quiet dinners where conversations stretched long into the night. But while their relationship was developing naturally, another part of Gary's life was moving just as quickly. His company was expanding. Major contracts were being signed. New partnerships were forming across multiple states. What had once been a successful regional business was quickly becoming something much larger. And with that growth came attention. Investors who had supported Gary from the beginning were watching every decision he made more closely than ever before. Board meetings became more frequent. Financial discussions lasted longer. Business travel started filling large sections of Gary's schedule. At first, Gary handled the pressure easily. He had spent years building the company into what it was, and he understood the demands that came with success. But gradually, the tone of certain conversations began to change. During one meeting in the downtown office overlooking the Mississippi River, a discussion about expansion shifted in an unexpected direction. One of the investors leaned back in his chair and spoke carefully. "Gary, there's something we've been meaning to ask." Gary looked up from the documents in front of him. "What is it?" The investor exchanged a brief glance with others seated at the table before continuing. "We've noticed you've been appearing at several events lately with someone." Gary didn't answer immediately. The room felt slightly quieter. "It's a personal matter," he said calmly. Another voice responded from across the table. "Normally that wouldn't concern us, but right now the company is entering a critical phase." Gary understood what they were implying even before the next sentence arrived. "Public image matters," the investor continued. "People pay attention to the choices leaders make." Gary's jaw tightened slightly. "My personal life doesn't affect how I run this company." "No one is questioning your leadership," the investor replied quickly. "But perception can influence confidence." The conversation moved back to business soon afterward, but the message had already been delivered. Gary left the meeting with a quiet weight forming in his thoughts. Until that moment, he hadn't considered that his relationship with Teresa might become a topic of discussion inside corporate boardrooms. Over the following weeks, similar remarks appeared in other conversations. Sometimes subtle, sometimes more direct. A colleague might casually ask about his long-term plans. Someone else might mention how public attention could shape investor confidence. None of the comments directly criticized Teresa, but the meaning behind them was clear. People in Gary's professional world preferred stability, predictability, relationships that fit comfortably within the circles they understood. Meanwhile, Gary and Teresa continued spending time together whenever his schedule allowed. But Teresa began noticing small changes. Gary was still attentive, still kind, still interested in hearing about her work and the events she organized. Yet something felt different. He started canceling plans more often. Sometimes meetings ran late. Other times, unexpected travel forced him to reschedule dinners they had planned days earlier. One evening, Teresa sat at a small table inside a restaurant where they were supposed to meet for dinner. She glanced at her phone. Another message from Gary. "Running late again. I'm really sorry." Teresa sighed softly. This wasn't the first time. When Gary finally arrived nearly an hour later, he looked exhausted. His suit jacket hung loosely over one arm, and he rubbed his forehead as he sat down. "Long day?" Teresa asked gently. Gary nodded. "Several long days." Teresa studied his expression carefully. "You've been working a lot lately." Gary gave a small, tired smile. "The company is expanding faster than we expected. Everyone wants results immediately." Teresa nodded. She understood ambition. But something about the way Gary spoke felt heavier than simple work stress. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly. Gary hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, just pressure." Teresa leaned forward slightly. "Pressure from the business?" Gary looked down at the table. "From a lot of directions." Teresa didn't push further, but as the weeks continued, the pattern remained. More meetings, more travel, more canceled plans. The time they spent together became less frequent, and the easy rhythm their relationship once carried began feeling strained. Teresa noticed the difference clearly. Gary wasn't acting cold. He wasn't angry, but the distance between them was growing, and neither of them had yet found the right words to explain why. Because sometimes the hardest part of a relationship isn't conflict. Sometimes it's the quiet space that forms when outside pressure begins shaping decisions neither person truly wants to make. And that quiet space was slowly growing wider between Gary and Teresa. As the weeks continued passing in Memphis, the pattern that had quietly begun in Gary and Teresa's relationship became harder to ignore. At first, it was only occasional scheduled conflicts. A dinner moved to another night. An event Gary planned to attend, but couldn't. A quick phone call replacing an evening they once would have spent together. But slowly, those moments became more frequent. Teresa tried to be understanding. She knew Gary's company was growing quickly. She knew success at that level required intense focus and constant decision-making. Still, she could feel the difference. The easy rhythm that once defined their time together was no longer there. One evening, Teresa prepared dinner at her small home in Memphis. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple meal she knew Gary liked. She set 2 plates on the table and checked the clock. Gary was supposed to arrive at 7. 7 came and passed. At 7:30, her phone buzzed. A message from Gary, running late again. "I'm sorry." Teresa stared at the message for a moment before placing the phone back on the table. This had happened several times before. She wasn't angry, but she couldn't ignore the quiet disappointment building inside her. Nearly an hour later, Gary finally arrived. He knocked gently on the door, looking tired when Teresa opened it. His shoulders seemed heavier than usual, and the confident energy she once admired had been replaced by visible exhaustion. "Hey," Gary said softly. "Hey," Teresa replied. She stepped aside so he could enter. The smell of the meal she had prepared still filled the house. Gary glanced at the table. "You cooked?" Teresa nodded. "Nothing fancy." They sat down across from each other, but the conversation that once flowed easily now felt slower. Gary took a bite of food and gave a tired smile. "This is really good." Teresa thanked him quietly, but her mind was somewhere else. After a few moments of silence, she finally spoke. "Gary, can I ask you something?" Gary looked up. "Of course." Teresa rested her hands together on the table. "Are we still moving in the same direction?" Gary frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Teresa chose her words carefully. "When we first started seeing each other, everything felt simple. We made time for each other. We talked about things that mattered." She paused briefly. "But lately it feels like life is pulling you somewhere else." Gary leaned back in his chair, running a hand across his face. "I won't lie to you," he admitted. "Things at work have become overwhelming." Teresa nodded slowly. "I understand pressure. That's not what I'm asking." Gary looked at her carefully. "Then what are you asking?" Teresa met his eyes directly. "I'm asking if there's still space for us in your life." The question hung in the air between them. Gary didn't answer immediately, and in that quiet moment, Teresa felt the truth before he even spoke. Gary finally sighed. "I care about you, Teresa. You know that." "I do," she said softly. "But caring and building a future are two different things." Gary looked down at the table. His silence revealed more than words could. Teresa nodded slowly. She wasn't surprised. She had already sensed the answer in the distance that had been growing between them. After dinner, they stepped outside onto Teresa's small front porch. The Memphis night was warm and calm. Street lights glowed along the quiet road while distant music drifted faintly from somewhere in the neighborhood. They sat side by side for a while without speaking. Finally, Gary broke the silence. "I never expected things to become this complicated." Teresa smiled gently. "Life doesn't ask for our expectations before it changes things." Gary looked at her. "You deserve someone who can give you more time than I've been able to lately." Teresa considered that statement. "Maybe," she said quietly. "But I also believe people choose where they place their time." Gary didn't argue, because deep down, he knew she was right. For a while they simply watched the quiet street. No anger, no shouting, just two people acknowledging something difficult. Eventually Teresa stood up. "I think we both know what this moment means," she said softly. Gary nodded. "Yes." Their goodbye wasn't dramatic. There were no harsh words, just understanding. Gary stood and gave her a gentle hug. "Thank you for everything," he said. Teresa smiled. "Take care of yourself, Gary." Gary walked down the steps of the porch and toward his car. For a moment he paused and looked back. Teresa was still standing near the doorway. Then he got into the car and drove away. Teresa watched the headlights disappear down the street. She felt sadness, of course, but also peace. Some relationships end with anger. Others end with acceptance. And that night, both Gary and Teresa believed their story had simply reached its natural conclusion. Neither of them realized something important had already begun. Because not long after Gary drove away from that quiet porch in Memphis, Teresa would discover a truth that would change both of their lives forever. She was pregnant, and she wasn't carrying just one child, but twins. A few weeks after Gary drove away from Teresa's porch that quiet Memphis evening, life began settling into a different rhythm for her. The relationship that had once filled many of her evenings was now a memory she tried not to dwell on too often. Teresa returned her focus to work. The cultural arts organization where she worked had several upcoming events scheduled across Memphis. Planning them required long hours, constant coordination, and careful attention to detail. Normally, Teresa enjoyed that kind of busy schedule, but something felt different lately. At first, it was small things. She felt unusually tired after long work days. Some mornings she woke up feeling slightly dizzy. Once or twice she found herself sitting quietly during lunch breaks, trying to figure out why her body didn't feel quite right. Teresa brushed it off at first. Stress could do strange things. The breakup with Gary had affected her more than she admitted, even if the conversation between them had ended peacefully. But after another week passed, the unusual symptoms continued. One evening after returning home from work, Teresa sat at her kitchen table, staring at a small box she had purchased earlier that afternoon. She had hesitated before buying it. Even now, she wasn't completely sure why she felt the need to take the test. Still, a quiet instinct told her she needed to know. The apartment was silent as she walked into the bathroom. Minutes later, Teresa returned to the kitchen holding the small test in her hand. She looked down at it, then looked again. Her breath caught slightly. 2 lines. Teresa sat down slowly in the chair. Pregnant. For a moment, she simply stared at the test without speaking. Her thoughts raced in different directions all at once. The breakup with Gary had only happened a few weeks earlier. They hadn't spoken since that night on the porch. And now, this. Teresa placed both hands on the table and closed her eyes. The news didn't make her angry, but it did leave her stunned. Life had just changed direction in a way she never expected. The next morning, Teresa scheduled a medical appointment in Memphis to confirm the result. Sitting in the waiting room felt strangely unreal. Around her, other people flipped through magazines or looked at their phones while waiting for their names to be called. Teresa sat quietly, thinking about how much her life might be about to change. When the doctor finally returned with the results, Teresa sat upright in the chair. The doctor spoke calmly. "Yes, you are pregnant." Teresa nodded slowly. She had expected that answer. But then the doctor added something she hadn't expected. "There's something else you should know." Teresa looked up. "You're not carrying one baby." The doctor turned the screen toward her and pointed to the image. "Based on the ultrasound, you're expecting twins." For a moment, Teresa didn't respond. Twins, the word echoed in her thoughts. 2 babies, 2 new lives. The weight of that reality settled over her slowly. Leaving the clinic later that afternoon, Teresa walked through the Memphis streets with quiet determination forming inside her. Of course, Gary was the father, but their relationship had ended, and she knew how much pressure already surrounded his life. His company, his reputation, his world. Teresa thought about the peaceful conversation they shared on her porch, the understanding that their paths were moving in different directions. For hours she considered the possibility of calling him, but each time the idea surfaced, she paused. Eventually she made a decision. She would not rush to change Gary's life. These children were her responsibility first. Teresa stopped walking for a moment and placed a hand gently over her stomach. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Well, looks like it's going to be the 3 of us." The thought didn't scare her as much as she expected. Teresa had always believed in strength, community, and resilience. And even though the road ahead would not be easy, she knew one thing for certain. Those children would grow up surrounded by love, even if she had to build that life for them herself. What Teresa didn't know yet was that Gary's life was already moving toward a completely different chapter. A chapter that would make her decision even more complicated. In the weeks that followed Teresa's visit to the clinic, her life slowly adjusted to a new reality. Every morning she woke up aware of something she hadn't expected only a short time earlier. She was going to be a mother, not just once, twice. The realization still felt overwhelming at times, but Teresa approached it the same way she handled most challenges in her life, with steady focus and quiet determination. She continued working as an event coordinator for the cultural arts organization in Memphis, planning community festivals, organizing music programs, and bringing neighborhoods together remained a big part of her daily routine. Yet now, everything carried a slightly different meaning. While she arranged stage equipment or coordinated schedules for musicians, her thoughts occasionally drifted to the future. 2 small children, 2 lives depending on her strength. The idea both frightened and motivated her. One afternoon, while taking a short break at work, Teresa sat in a small office reviewing announcements for upcoming cultural events around Memphis. Her phone rested on the desk beside her. A notification appeared from a local news outlet. Normally she wouldn't pay much attention to those alerts, but the headline caught her eye immediately. The name was impossible to miss. Gary. Teresa opened the article slowly. The screen displayed a photograph taken at a formal charity gathering in downtown Memphis. Gary stood in a tailored suit, smiling confidently while standing beside a woman dressed in an elegant evening gown. Below the image was the announcement. One of Memphis's most successful business leaders had recently become engaged. The article described Gary's continued business success, mentioning how his logistics company had expanded into new markets and gained attention from major investors across the country. Near the end of the piece, the writer congratulated him on his upcoming wedding. Teresa stared at the screen quietly. She felt a brief wave of emotion rise in her chest. Not anger, not jealousy, just the quiet realization that Gary's life had already moved forward. The engagement explained many things. The increased pressure from his professional world, the distance that had slowly appeared between them before their relationship ended. Gary had stepped into a different future. Teresa placed the phone down on the desk. For several minutes she sat without speaking, letting the information settle in her thoughts. Then she gently rested one hand on her stomach. The twins were still too small for her to feel movement, but the awareness of their presence had already become part of her daily life. Teresa understood something important in that moment. Calling Gary now would change everything. His engagement, his reputation, the carefully structured life he was building. She remembered the conversation they had shared on her porch the night they ended their relationship. There had been honesty between them, respect. Neither of them wanted to create conflict where peace had already been reached. Teresa took a slow breath. She had always believed that difficult decisions revealed a person's true character, and this was one of those moments. After thinking carefully, she reached a quiet conclusion. Gary deserved to live the life he had chosen. The children growing inside her deserved stability and love. Teresa would build that life without forcing anyone else into it. That evening, after finishing work, Teresa walked through her neighborhood in Memphis as the sun began setting. Neighbors sat on front porches chatting while children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Someone grilled food nearby, the smell drifting through the warm air. These familiar scenes reminded Teresa of something she had known since childhood. She wasn't alone. Her community had always believed in supporting one another. Teresa began quietly preparing for the months ahead. She organized her finances carefully. She rearranged parts of her home to create space for 2 babies. Some evenings she researched parenting advice or read about raising twins. Other nights she simply sat quietly thinking about the future. At times the responsibility felt enormous, but Teresa never allowed fear to replace determination. She had faced difficult moments before in life, and she would face this one the same way, with strength. Weeks turned into months. Her pregnancy slowly became more visible. The twins continued growing. And through it all, Teresa held on to the decision she had made that afternoon when she saw Gary's engagement announcement. She would not interfere with his life. At least, that was the plan she believed would carry her through the coming months. But life rarely follows plans exactly the way we expect, because eventually, a moment would arrive when silence was no longer an option, and that moment would come much sooner than Teresa imagined. As the months passed in Memphis, Teresa gradually grew used to the rhythm of preparing for 2 new lives. Her pregnancy had progressed steadily. Doctor visits, careful planning, and adjustments to her daily routine became part of her schedule. The small changes in her body reminded her constantly that the future was approaching faster than she once imagined. At first, the idea of raising twins on her own had felt overwhelming, but Teresa handled each challenge step by step. She rearranged the furniture in her home to create space for 2 cribs. She researched parenting guides late at night and learned how to prepare for the arrival of twins. She saved money carefully and adjusted her work schedule so she could continue doing the job she loved while preparing for motherhood. Her neighborhood in Memphis remained a source of quiet encouragement. Neighbors greeted her warmly during evening walks. Familiar faces stopped to ask how she was feeling and whether she needed help carrying groceries. The sense of community she had always valued now felt even more meaningful. Through all of it, Teresa held on to the decision she had made months earlier. She would raise the children without disturbing Gary's life. But life has a way of shifting plans without warning. One early morning, before the sun had fully risen over Memphis, Teresa woke with a sudden tightening across her stomach. At first, she thought it might simply be discomfort from sleeping in the wrong position. She sat up slowly and waited for the feeling to pass. Instead, the sensation returned a few minutes later. Stronger. Teresa took a deep breath. Her due date was still a few weeks away. Yet the pattern of pressure growing and fading felt familiar from the description she had read about labor. She stood carefully and walked to the kitchen, trying to stay calm. Another wave came. This time there was no doubt. The twins were coming. Teresa grabbed her bag, already prepared weeks earlier, and made her way to a nearby hospital in Memphis. By the time she arrived, the contractions had grown stronger. Inside the maternity ward, nurses quickly guided her into a delivery room. The environment around her moved with calm efficiency. Medical equipment hummed quietly. Nurses checked monitors and spoke in reassuring voices. "You're doing fine," one nurse said while adjusting a machine beside the bed. Teresa nodded, breathing slowly as she focused on the instructions they gave her. Despite the pain building through each contraction, her mind remained surprisingly clear. She had prepared for this moment. She knew what was happening. And most importantly, she knew that by the end of the day she would finally meet the two children she had spent months protecting. Yet as the contractions grew stronger, another thought slowly began to rise in her mind. Gary. For months, she had chosen silence. She believed she was protecting his life by keeping the pregnancy to herself. But now the twins were about to be born, two lives that belonged to both of them. Teresa closed her eyes briefly as another contraction passed. One of the nurses noticed the thoughtful expression on her face. "Is everything all right?" The nurse asked gently. Teresa nodded, though she hesitated before speaking. "There's something I've been thinking about." The nurse leaned slightly closer so she could hear her. "The father," Teresa said quietly. "He doesn't know about the twins." The nurse looked surprised but remained calm. "Do you want us to contact him?" Teresa stared at the ceiling for a moment while another contraction slowly faded. She had spent months convincing herself that silence was the right choice. But this moment felt different. These children deserved honesty. Gary deserved the chance to know his children were entering the world. Teresa took a slow breath. "Yes," she said finally. "I think he should know." The nurse nodded. "Do you have his number?" Teresa gave it to her. A few minutes later, the nurse stepped out into the hallway and dialed the number. Across Memphis, in a luxury hotel ballroom overlooking the Mississippi River, a wedding ceremony was only minutes away from beginning. Inside that ballroom stood Gary, dressed in an expensive tuxedo, surrounded by hundreds of guests waiting for the ceremony to begin. Gary's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced down at the unfamiliar number. Normally, he would ignore calls from unknown numbers during an important moment like this, but something about the timing made him hesitate. He stepped aside and answered. "Hello?" The nurse spoke calmly from the hospital hallway. "Hello, is this Gary?" "Yes. I'm calling from a hospital in Memphis." Gary's expression changed slightly. "A hospital? There's someone here who asked us to contact you." Gary felt a strange tension in his chest. "Who?" The nurse answered clearly. "Teresa." Gary froze. The nurse continued. "She's currently in labor." Gary struggled to process the words. "In labor?" "Yes." There was a brief pause. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "She says the twins she's delivering are yours." And just like that, the past Gary thought he had left behind returned at the most unexpected moment of his life. Right on the day of his wedding, Gary stood near the altar inside the grand ballroom of the Memphis Hotel, still holding his phone to his ear. The nurse's voice had just delivered a sentence that seemed impossible to process. "Teresa is in labor, and the twins she's delivering are yours." For several seconds, Gary didn't respond. The words echoed in his mind, while the sounds of the ballroom faded into the background. Twins, his children. The idea felt unreal. Gary closed his eyes briefly, trying to steady his thoughts. Across the room, the string quartet had already stopped playing as guests prepared for the ceremony to begin. Conversations had softened to quiet murmurs while everyone waited for the bride to appear. But Gary was no longer paying attention to the celebration around him. His mind had traveled somewhere else entirely, back to memories he hadn't thought about in months. Teresa, the music festival by the river, their dinners across Memphis, the quiet evening on her porch when they said goodbye. Gary spoke into the phone slowly. "You're certain?" he asked. The nurse answered calmly, "Yes, she's in active labor right now." Gary's chest tightened. "In labor? Right now?" "Yes," the nurse replied. "She asked us to contact you." Gary glanced across the ballroom. Guests filled the elegant chairs arranged along the aisle. Business partners, friends, family members, everyone had gathered to watch him get married. The wedding ceremony was moments away from beginning. Yet somewhere across Memphis, Teresa was in a hospital room preparing to bring 2 children into the world. His children. Gary struggled to organize his thoughts. "Why didn't she tell me before now?" he asked quietly. The nurse answered gently, "She didn't want to interfere with your life." Those words hit him harder than he expected. Gary looked down at the polished floor beneath his shoes. For months he had assumed the chapter of his life that included Teresa had simply ended. He had moved forward, focused on business, accepted the expectations placed on him by investors in his professional circle, and eventually he had stepped into a new relationship that led to this wedding. But the phone call revealed something he had never imagined. While he believed the past had been left behind, Teresa had been carrying a secret that would change everything. 2 children. Gary slowly exhaled. "How far along is the labor?" he asked. The nurse answered carefully. "It's progressing quickly." Gary pressed a hand against his forehead. The timing felt impossible. He was standing at the altar on the day of his wedding. Guests filled the room. The ceremony could begin at any moment. Yet the call from the hospital had placed him in a situation no one in the ballroom could possibly understand. Gary turned slightly and looked toward the tall windows at the far end of the room. Beyond the glass, the Memphis skyline stretched across the horizon while the Mississippi River moved steadily through the city. Somewhere out there, Teresa was fighting through labor. Gary's thoughts raced. He imagined the hospital room, the uncertainty Teresa must be feeling, the responsibility that now stood directly in front of him. Gary spoke into the phone again. "Is she okay?" "Yes," the nurse said reassuringly. "She's strong." Gary nodded slowly, even though the nurse couldn't see him. "Thank you for calling." "Of course," the nurse replied. Gary lowered the phone from his ear. For a moment he simply stood there, staring at the device in his hand. The world around him seemed strangely distant. Guests were smiling. Wedding decorations filled the room with elegance. Everything looked perfect. But Gary knew something none of them knew. The life he believed he was about to begin had just collided with the past in a way he couldn't ignore. His children were about to be born, and he had only moments to decide what kind of man he would be. Gary stood still for several long moments after lowering the phone. The conversation with the nurse had ended, but the weight of her words remained in the air around him. Twins, his children. Somewhere across Memphis, Teresa was in a hospital room bringing 2 new lives into the world. The reality of that moment felt heavier with every second that passed. Gary looked down at the phone in his hand again as if the device itself might suddenly provide clarity. It didn't. Instead, the quiet music of the ballroom slowly returned to his awareness. The string quartet had begun preparing to play again, while guests shifted in their seats. Everyone believed the ceremony would begin at any moment. No one knew that Gary's mind was now somewhere far beyond the elegant room surrounding him. He slowly turned toward the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom. From that height, Memphis stretched across the horizon beneath the bright afternoon sky. The Mississippi River moved steadily through the city, reflecting sunlight as cars traveled across the nearby bridge. Gary stared at the view for a long moment. That city held years of his life, the company he had built from the ground up, the reputation he had spent years protecting. And somewhere within that same city was Teresa. Gary remembered the night they first met near the Riverfront Festival, the easy way she had spoken to him, the laughter that had followed their first conversation. He remembered the neighborhood cookout she invited him to, where people greeted him without caring about his wealth or business status. He remembered sitting across from her during long dinners when conversation felt effortless. Those memories had once been part of his everyday life. Now they returned with new meaning. Gary pressed his hands against the windowsill as his thoughts continued racing. Responsibility. The word carried more weight now than it ever had before. For months he believed that chapter of his life had ended when he and Teresa went their separate ways. He accepted the direction his life was moving and tried to focus on the expectations surrounding him. Investors expected stability. His professional world valued carefully managed appearances. And today's wedding had been arranged with the understanding that it would strengthen both his personal and professional future. Gary understood all of that. But standing there in the quiet moment after the phone call, he also understood something else. 2 children were about to enter the world, and they were his. Gary slowly turned away from the window and looked back across the ballroom. Rows of guests filled the seats along the aisle. Conversations continued in quiet excitement as people prepared for the ceremony to begin. Some guests checked their watches. Others smiled while taking photographs of the elegant decorations. They were waiting for him. Gary noticed a wedding planner near the front of the room, organizing final details. She glanced toward him briefly before returning to her notes, assuming everything was proceeding as planned. But nothing about this moment felt planned anymore. Gary took a slow breath. For years he had been known as someone who could make difficult decisions under pressure. Business deals worth millions of dollars had required careful judgment, yet none of those moments compared to the choice now standing in front of him. One path would allow the ceremony to continue exactly as expected. He could place the phone back in his pocket, return to the altar, and move forward with the life everyone believed he was about to begin. Most people in the room would never know about the call from the hospital. The celebration would continue. The wedding photographs would be taken. Life would proceed exactly according to the plan everyone had carefully arranged. But another path now existed. That path meant stepping away from the expectations filling the ballroom. It meant acknowledging the reality that 2 children were about to be born across the city. Gary closed his eyes for a brief moment. He imagined the hospital room again. Teresa breathing through the pain of labor. 2 newborn children entering the world. His children. Gary opened his eyes. The answer became clear. No celebration, no reputation, and no carefully planned future could erase the responsibility he now carried. Gary straightened his jacket slowly. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then he took a step away from the altar. And another. Guests nearby noticed the movement immediately. A few heads turned as whispers quietly began spreading through the room. The wedding planner looked up in confusion. "Gary," she called softly. But Gary didn't stop. He continued walking down the aisle, straight toward the ballroom doors, because the decision had already been made, and once that realization settled in his mind, there was no hesitation left. Gary was leaving the wedding. Gary's footsteps echoed quietly across the polished floor of the ballroom as he moved away from the altar. At first, most of the guests assumed the movement meant something minor. Perhaps the groom needed a moment before the ceremony began. Weddings often involved last-minute adjustments. But when Gary passed the first row of chairs without stopping, a ripple of confusion began spreading through the room. Guests turned in their seats, watching him walk steadily down the aisle. Whispers began forming between them. Where is he going? Is something wrong? The wedding planner, who had been organizing the final details, hurried forward, trying to catch up with him. "Gary," she called gently, attempting to keep her voice calm. "The ceremony is about to begin." Gary paused briefly, but didn't turn around. "There's something I need to handle," he said. The planner blinked in surprise. "Right now?" Gary nodded once. "Yes." Before she could ask anything else, he continued walking. The confusion in the room grew louder. Some guests leaned toward each other, trying to understand what was happening. Others stood slightly in their seats, attempting to see where the groom was going. From the far end of the ballroom, the entrance doors opened. Gary stepped out into the hallway. Behind him, the elegant room filled with murmurs as the carefully planned ceremony suddenly lost its center. Inside the hallway, the quiet contrast felt almost surreal. Moments earlier, Gary had been surrounded by hundreds of people, music and celebration. Now the long corridor outside the ballroom stood nearly empty. He walked quickly toward the main entrance of the hotel. The polished marble floors reflected the overhead lights as he moved past large windows overlooking downtown Memphis. For the first time since the phone call, Gary checked his watch. Every minute mattered now. Across the city, Teresa was in labor. 2 children were about to enter the world. Gary reached the front doors of the hotel and stepped outside. The Memphis afternoon air felt warmer than he expected. Cars passed along the busy street while pedestrians walked along the sidewalks, unaware that one of the city's most anticipated weddings had just been interrupted. A black car waited near the entrance. Gary moved quickly toward it and opened the door. The driver looked back with mild confusion. "Sir, I thought the ceremony was starting." Gary settled into the seat. "It was." The driver paused. "Where would you like to go?" Gary looked out the window toward the Memphis skyline. For a moment he imagined the hospital room where Teresa was waiting. He pictured the nurses moving through the maternity ward. He pictured the moment 2 newborn children would take their first breath. Then Gary answered, "The hospital." The car pulled away from the hotel and entered the flow of traffic moving through downtown Memphis. Behind them, inside the ballroom, the confusion continued spreading. Guests stood from their seats, whispering among themselves as they tried to understand what had just happened. The wedding planner moved quickly between groups of guests, attempting to maintain calm. But no one had expected the groom to disappear moments before the ceremony. Questions filled the room. Phones appeared as some guests began sending messages. Others walked toward the entrance of the ballroom, hoping to learn what was happening. Yet none of them knew the truth. The truth was moving quickly through Memphis traffic inside a black car heading toward the hospital. Gary sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window as the city passed by. The Mississippi River appeared briefly between the buildings as the car crossed an intersection. His thoughts were no longer focused on the wedding he had just left behind. Instead, his mind remained fixed on the moment waiting for him at the hospital. 2 children, 2 lives connected to his own in a way that changed everything. For the first time since receiving the phone call, Gary felt a strange sense of clarity. The decision he made inside the ballroom had shocked everyone who witnessed it. But to him, it now felt simple. Life had placed responsibility in front of him, and he had chosen to face it. The car turned onto a street leading toward the hospital. Gary leaned slightly forward in his seat. "We're close," he said quietly. Outside the window, the hospital building came into view. Inside that building, Teresa was preparing to meet the twins she had carried for months. And within minutes, Gary's life would change forever. The wedding that had been planned for months was already fading into the past, because the real story was just beginning. The car slowed as it pulled into the hospital entrance in Memphis. Gary stepped out quickly, barely noticing the quiet afternoon traffic moving through the nearby streets. The moment his shoes touched the pavement, his focus narrowed to one thought: Teresa. Inside the building, the hospital lobby felt calm compared to the storm of emotions moving through Gary's mind. The bright lights reflected off the polished floors while visitors passed through the entrance, unaware of the decision that had brought him there. Gary approached the front desk quickly. "Teresa," he said, slightly out of breath. "She was admitted earlier today." A staff member checked the information and nodded toward the elevator. "Maternity floor." Gary thanked them and moved quickly across the lobby. The elevator ride felt longer than it actually was. Each passing second reminded him that somewhere above him Teresa was facing one of the most difficult moments of her life. When the elevator doors opened, Gary stepped into the maternity ward. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and carried the quiet sounds of hospital activity. Nurses moved calmly between rooms while soft voices echoed through the corridor. One of the nurses recognized the name he had given earlier and pointed toward a room near the end of the hall. "She's in there." Gary walked slowly toward the door. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Only a few hours earlier, he had been standing inside a ballroom filled with hundreds of guests preparing for a wedding. Now he stood outside a hospital room where 2 children connected to his life were about to be born. Gary pushed the door open gently. Inside the delivery room, Teresa was gripping the bedrail as another contraction passed through her body. The room carried the steady rhythm of medical monitors and quiet instructions from the staff assisting her. When Teresa looked up and saw the figure standing near the door, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Gary." Her voice carried both shock and confusion. Gary stepped closer. "I came as soon as I could." Teresa stared at him for a moment, trying to process what she was seeing. "You left your wedding?" Gary nodded quietly. "Yes." Another contraction interrupted the moment. Teresa closed her eyes tightly as she breathed through the pain while the nurses encouraged her. "You're doing well," one of them said calmly. Gary moved closer to the side of the bed. For a moment, he wasn't sure what to say. The situation felt overwhelming. Teresa looked at him again between breaths. "I didn't expect you to come," she admitted. Gary shook his head slightly. "I couldn't stay away after hearing that call." Teresa studied his expression. Despite the tension in the room, she could see the seriousness in his eyes. Gary wasn't there out of obligation. He had made a choice. Another contraction began building. Teresa gripped the bed again as the nurse spoke reassuringly. "Stay with your breathing." Gary instinctively reached for her hand. Teresa didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand tightly as the wave of pain passed. The moment felt strangely quiet despite the urgency surrounding them. Months earlier, they had believed their relationship had ended. Now they stood together again during the most important moment of both their lives. A nurse glanced toward the monitor. "It's almost time." Teresa took several steady breaths. Gary remained beside her. Minutes later, the room filled with new energy as the final stage of labor began. "Push," one of the nurses instructed gently. Teresa focused with determination. Gary stayed beside her, offering quiet encouragement. "You're doing great," he said. Teresa pushed again. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Then suddenly, a small cry filled the room. Clear, strong, alive. One of the nurses lifted the newborn gently. "A healthy baby girl," the nurse announced. Teresa collapsed back against the pillow, exhausted but smiling through tears. Gary stared at the tiny child in disbelief. The first twin had arrived. And in that moment, Gary realized the life he once believed he was about to begin had already changed forever. The newborn cry still echoed softly in the delivery room. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. Teresa lay back against the pillow, her breathing heavy from the effort she had just given. Strands of hair clung to her forehead, while exhaustion and relief mixed across her face. The nurse carefully wrapped the baby girl in a small blanket before placing her gently in Teresa's arms. Teresa looked down at the tiny face staring back at her. Her eyes filled with tears. "Hello there," she whispered softly. Gary stood beside the bed, staring in quiet amazement. He had spent years building a business empire. He had negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars. He had stood confidently in rooms filled with powerful people. Yet nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. The small baby in Teresa's arms moved slightly, making a soft sound as she adjusted inside the blanket. Gary leaned closer. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. Teresa smiled weakly. "Yes, she is." But the moment of calm did not last long. One of the nurses glanced at the monitor again and spoke gently. "We're not finished yet." Gary looked confused for a moment before remembering. The twins. Teresa was still bringing another child into the world. Another contraction began building almost immediately. Teresa squeezed Gary's hand again as the pain returned. "Okay," she said through clenched teeth, trying to steady herself. The nurse spoke calmly. "You're doing great. Just a little more." Gary stood beside her again, his attention now fully focused on helping her through the next stage. "You've got this," he said quietly. Teresa nodded as she gathered her strength. The room filled once again with focused energy as the nurses prepared for the arrival of the second baby. Moments passed slowly, then another push, and another. Finally, another cry filled the room, this one slightly louder than the first. The nurse lifted the second newborn carefully. "A healthy baby boy," the nurse announced. Gary felt his chest tighten as he watched the moment unfold. 2 children, both of them his. The baby boy was quickly wrapped in a blanket before being brought closer. Teresa looked at both newborns with overwhelming emotion. Her voice trembled slightly. "They're really here?" Gary nodded slowly. "Yes, they are." One of the nurses gently approached Gary. "Would you like to hold him?" Gary hesitated. For a man used to controlling complex situations, the idea of holding such a fragile life made him strangely nervous. "I don't want to hurt him," Gary admitted quietly. The nurse smiled reassuringly. "You won't." Carefully, she placed the baby boy in Gary's arms. Gary looked down at the tiny face resting against the blanket. The baby moved slightly, making a small sound before settling again. For a moment, Gary simply stared. The feeling that washed over him was something he had never experienced before. This wasn't business. This wasn't ambition. This was responsibility. Real, undeniable responsibility. Gary felt something shift deep inside his thoughts. All the pressure he had felt earlier in the ballroom suddenly seemed distant and unimportant. The expectations of investors, the carefully structured life he had built, the wedding he had just walked away from, none of it carried the same weight anymore. Gary looked toward Teresa. She was holding the baby girl close, her eyes filled with quiet happiness despite the exhaustion. Teresa noticed the expression on Gary's face. "You're quiet," she said softly. Gary nodded. "I'm trying to understand how everything changed so quickly." Teresa smiled faintly. "That's what children do." Gary looked back down at the baby boy in his arms. The tiny hand moved slightly against the blanket. Gary felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. He had spent years measuring success through achievements, profits, and recognition. But now he realized something important. None of those things compared to this moment. Gary carefully adjusted his hold on the baby. "They deserve the best life possible," he said quietly. Teresa looked at him thoughtfully. "Yes, they do." Gary lifted his gaze and met her eyes. "And they're going to have it." The room remained peaceful as the twins rested safely in their parents' arms. Outside the hospital window, Memphis continued moving through its usual rhythm. But inside the delivery room, everything had changed. 2 new lives had entered the world. And in that quiet moment, Gary understood something clearly. The choices he made from this day forward would no longer be measured only by business success. They would be measured by something far more important, the kind of father he chose to become. The delivery room slowly settled into a quiet calm. The rush of activity that had filled the space only minutes earlier had faded into a peaceful rhythm. Soft sounds from the medical monitors continued in the background while the nurses completed their final checks before stepping out to give Teresa time to rest. Teresa leaned back against the pillows, holding the baby girl gently against her chest. The tiny newborn had already drifted into sleep, her small fingers curled softly against the blanket. Across the bed, Gary still held the baby boy carefully in his arms. The room felt different now. The urgency of labor had passed, replaced by a moment that felt almost unreal. 2 newborns, 2 lives that had just begun. Gary looked down at the baby boy again. For the first time in years, his mind was completely quiet. Teresa watched him for a moment before speaking. "You look like you're still trying to process everything." Gary let out a small breath. "I think I am." Teresa smiled slightly. "That's normal." Gary walked closer to the bed so the twins were only inches apart. "They're perfect," he said quietly. Teresa nodded. "Yes, they are." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the 2 tiny children resting peacefully. Then Teresa looked up at Gary again. "You didn't have to come," she said softly. Gary frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You had a wedding today," she replied. Gary shifted the baby boy gently in his arms. "I know." Teresa studied his face. "You walked away from all of that." Gary sat down in the chair beside the bed. "Yes." Teresa hesitated before asking the question that had been quietly forming in her mind. "Why?" Gary didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the hospital window where the lights of Memphis were beginning to glow in the distance as evening approached. For years he had measured every decision carefully. Profit, reputation, opportunity. But none of those things had been on his mind when the nurse told him about the twins. Gary finally spoke. "Because some decisions tell you exactly who you are." Teresa listened quietly. Gary continued. "When the nurse said you were in labor, I realized something immediately." He glanced down at the baby boy again. No business deal, no reputation, no perfectly planned future could matter more than this moment. Teresa's eyes softened. Gary looked back at her. "These 2 children are my responsibility." Teresa nodded slowly. "I never expected you to feel forced into anything." Gary shook his head. "I'm not here because I feel forced." He paused before continuing. "I'm here because this is where I belong." The words settled into the quiet room. Teresa looked down at the twins again. For months, she had prepared herself to raise them alone. She had built plans around the idea that Gary's life was moving in a different direction. But now, sitting in that hospital room, the future suddenly looked different. Gary leaned forward slightly. "I know things between us ended months ago," he said. Teresa nodded. "They did. And I know we both believed our lives were heading in separate directions." "That's true," she replied. Gary took a moment before speaking again. "But these 2 just changed everything." Teresa smiled faintly. "That's one way to describe it." Gary laughed quietly. Then his expression became more serious. "I don't know exactly what the future looks like yet," he admitted. "But I do know one thing." He looked at the twins again. "They deserve honesty, stability, and love from both of us." Teresa studied his expression carefully. "And you're ready for that?" Gary nodded without hesitation. Yes. The certainty in his voice left no doubt. Teresa looked down at the baby girl sleeping peacefully in her arms. For the first time since discovering she was pregnant, she felt the pressure she had carried begin to lift. Life had taken unexpected turns. Their relationship had faced challenges. But something meaningful had grown from everything they experienced. 2 children. 2 new beginnings. Gary stood up and moved closer to the bed again. He gently placed the baby boy beside his sister so the twins rested side by side. The sight made both of them smile. "They're going to have quite a story one day," Gary said. Teresa laughed softly. "Yes, they will." Gary looked toward the window again as the Memphis skyline glowed under the evening lights. Life had changed completely in a single day. A wedding had ended before it began. But something far more important had taken its place. Gary turned back toward Teresa and the twins. And in that quiet hospital room, a new chapter began. Not one built on expectations or pressure, but one built on responsibility, growth, and the simple truth that sometimes life's biggest surprises become its most meaningful blessings. Because in the end, success isn't measured by wealth or status. It's measured by the choices people make when life asks them to show their character. And on that day in Memphis, Gary had made the choice that truly mattered. A choice that would shape the lives of 2 children and begin a story that would last far beyond the moment they first opened their eyes. Before we close this story, let's pause for a moment and reflect on what just happened. Gary started the day standing in a luxury ballroom in Memphis, surrounded by wealth, reputation, and expectations. Everything about his life seemed carefully planned and perfectly controlled. But one unexpected phone call forced him to face a truth that no business success could replace: responsibility. 2 children were about to enter the world, and in that moment, Gary had to decide what mattered more, his public image or his character. He chose responsibility. Teresa faced her own test of character long before that day. When she discovered she was pregnant, she didn't react with anger or demand anything from Gary. Instead, she focused on protecting the children and preparing herself to raise them with dignity and strength. Her decision showed something powerful. True maturity is not about winning arguments or proving someone wrong. It's about choosing what protects the future. And when Gary finally walked into that delivery room, something changed in both of them. Not because their past suddenly became perfect, but because they both chose honesty, responsibility, and love for the lives that depended on them. That is the real lesson of this story. Life will often place people at crossroads they never expected. Moments when reputation, pride, or comfort seem easier than doing what is right. But the decisions made during those moments define who we truly are. Gary could have ignored the call. He could have stayed at the wedding and pretended the past no longer existed. But character is revealed when people choose responsibility even when it is inconvenient. Teresa showed strength by preparing to raise the twins with courage. Gary showed growth by walking away from expectations and stepping toward fatherhood. And those choices created something far more meaningful than the perfect wedding everyone expected. They created a new beginning. 2 children who would grow up knowing that when life demanded courage, their parents chose to do the right thing. So if this story meant something to you, take a moment to support the channel. Hit the like button so more people can discover stories that remind us what truly matters. Share this video with someone who believes that character still matters in this world. And most importantly, subscribe to Mr. Gray Family, where every story is built to inspire, challenge, and remind us that the choices we make today shape the lives we live tomorrow. And before you go, tell me something in the comments. If you were in Gary's position, standing at the altar on your wedding day and receiving that phone call, what would you have done? Would you stay and protect your reputation? Or would you walk away to face your responsibility? Your answer might reveal more about your character than you think. And here at Mr. Gray Family, every story begins with us, and the lessons we choose to carry forward